Hello, good afternoon. Today is Chapter 18, Gaining from International Trade. The trade sector of the United States. The growth of the United States trade sector. As is shown here on the graph, both exports and imports have grown substantially as a share of the U.S. economy since 1960. The size of the trade sector as a share of GDP more than doubled during 1960 through 2000. Since 2000, the growth of the trade sector as a share of the economy has slowed. Reductions in both transportation and communication costs, as well as lower trade barriers, have contributed to this growth. Today, China, Canada, Mexico, and Japan are the leading trading partners with the United States. The impact of international trade varies across industries. In some industries, U.S. firms are able to compete quite effectively, while in others they find it difficult to do so. And this subject is very apropos right now, given the fact that with the new Trump administration coming in, the Trump administration had threatened to impose tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. Then at the last moment, a deal was made between Canada and Mexico where they would both send 10,000 troops to the border to help fight illegal immigration and also the importation of fentanyl, which kills over 100,000 U.S. citizens per year. China was not so lucky, and an additional 10% tariffs was imposed on them. But I firmly believe that that will not last, and there will be some type of negotiation that will resolve that issue as well. But you can take a look at this chart, and you can see how much business the United States is doing with these countries. Gain from specialization and trade. Most international trade is not between the governments of different nations, but rather between the people and firms located in those different countries. Like other voluntary exchanges, international trade occurs because both the buyer and seller expect to gain and generally do. If both parties do not expect to gain, they would not agree to the exchange. With trade, a country's residents can gain by specializing in the production of goods they can produce economically. They can sell those goods in the world market and use the proceeds to import goods that would be expensive to produce domestically. The law of comparative advantage. The law of comparative advantage says that a group of individuals, regions, or nations can produce a larger joint output if each specializes in the production of goods in which it is a low opportunity cost producer and trades for goods which is a high opportunity cost producer. International trade leads to mutual gain because it allows each country to specialize more fully in the production of those things that it does best according to the law of comparative advantage. Trade makes it possible for each country to use more of its resources to produce those goods and services than that it can produce at a relatively low cost. With trade, it will be possible for the trading partners to consume a bundle of goods that it would be impossible for them to produce domestically. Gains from trade, a comparative advantage. This is an example of the United States and Japan, where we're taking a look at food and clothing. Columns 1 and 2 indicate the daily per worker output of the food and clothing industry in the US and Japan. Japanese workers can produce 3 units of food per day compared to only 2 units per day for US workers. They can also produce 9 units of clothing per day compared to 1 unit of clothing per day for US workers. Thus, Japan has an absolute advantage. The Japanese workers are able to produce more of both food and clothing than US workers. Are gains from trade possible when one country, such as Japan, has an absolute advantage in the production of both commodities? The answer is yes, because it is comparative advantage, not absolute advantage, that matters. Which country is the low opportunity cost producer of food? The opportunity cost for a unit of food in Japan is 3 units of clothing. In the United States, the opportunity cost for a unit of food is 1/2 a unit of clothing. Thus, the US is the low opportunity cost producer of food. Which country is the low opportunity cost producer of clothing? The opportunity cost of a unit of clothing in Japan is 1/3 of a unit of food. In the US, the opportunity cost of a unit of clothing is 2 units of food. Thus, Japan is the low opportunity cost producer of clothing. What happens when each specializes in the area of its comparative advantage? Food for the US and clothing for Japan. If the US moves 3 workers from clothing to food, it produces 6 more units of food and only 3 fewer of clothing. If Japan moves 1 worker from food to clothing, it produces 9 more units of clothing and only 3 fewer of food. With such a reallocation of labor, the US and Japan are able to increase their aggregate output of both food and clothing. PPC before specialization and trade. Here we illustrate the daily production of the labor force of both the US, that's 200 million people, and Japan, it's 50 million, given the production costs of food and clothing from the previous slide. In the absence of trade, consumption possibilities will be restricted to points like US1 in the US and J1 in Japan. Each of these points lies along the production possibilities curve, or the PPC, of the respective nation. Specialization and trade expand consumption possibilities. If the US trades food for clothing, 1 for 1, it can specialize in the production of food and consume along the ON line rather than its original production, possibly constraint M-N. We see this on the chart. Similarly, if Japan trades clothing for food, 1 for 1, it can specialize in the production of clothing and consume any combination along the RT line rather than its original RS line. For example, with specialization and trade, the US could increase its consumption from US1 to US2, gaining 50 million units of clothing and 100 million units of food. Simultaneously, Japan could increase consumption from J1 to J2, a gain of 125 million units of food and 25 million units of clothing. How exactly do the US and Japan consume at US2 and J2? The US produces 400 million units of food, consumes 200 million, and exports 200 million to Japan. Japan produces 450 units of clothing, consumes 250 million, and exports 200 million to the US. Each consumes more than it could produce domestically. International trade, the keys to prosperity. In addition to gains from specialization in areas of comparative advantage, international trade also leads to gains from 1. Economies of scale. International trade allows both domestic producers and consumers to gain from reductions in per unit costs that often accompany large-scale production, marketing, and distribution. More competitive markets. International trade promotes competition in domestic markets and allows consumers to purchase a wider variety of goods at economical prices. Supply, demand, and international trade. US has a comparative advantage. The price of soybeans and other internationally traded commodities is determined by the forces of supply and demand in the world market. If US soybean producers were prohibited from selling to foreigners, the domestic price would be in PN. And we have that right here. Free trade permits US soybean producers to sell QP units at the higher world price of PW, which is up here. At the world price of PW, the quantity QP minus QC is exported. Compared to the no trade situation, the producer's gain from the higher price exceeds the cost imposed on domestic producers by the triangular area. You can see that here. Consider the international market for manufactured shoes. In the absence of trade, the domestic price would be PN. As many foreigners producers have a comparative advantage in the production of shoes, international trade leads to lower prices. At the price PW, US consumers demand QC units, of which QC minus QP are imported. Compared to no trade, consumers gain in the area PN minus A minus B minus PW, while domestic producers lose area PN minus A minus C minus PW. A net gain of area ABC results, which is in here. International trade and specialization result in lower prices and more domestic consumption for imported products and higher prices, and less domestic consumption for exported products. Trade makes it possible for domestic producers to obtain higher prices for the items they export and for domestic consumers to buy imported items at lower prices. As a result, the residents of each nation are able to focus more of their resources on the things they do best, produce at a low cost, while trading for those goods for which they are high opportunity cost producers. Here's some questions for thought. Number 1, state the law of comparative advantage in your own words. Number 2, under what conditions can a nation gain from international trade? And number 3, do you think the 50 states of the United States would be better off if each imposed trade barriers limiting trade across state boundaries? Do you think the countries of North and South America would be better off if there were no trade restrictions limiting trade across national boundaries? Explain your response. Number 4, are the following statements true or false? If a nation is going to produce its maximum potential output and achieve full employment, it must impose tariffs and quotas in order to protect domestic industries and jobs. Everyone benefits when trade barriers are removed. When a country trades for those things for which it is a high-cost producer, it will be able to use more of its resources to produce items it can produce at a lower cost. The economics of trade restrictions. The average tariff rate, or taxes levied upon imports for the United States, is illustrated here. And years ago in 1890, it was almost 50%. And then by the 1935 or so, it was about 60%, but it's come way down since then. Trade restrictions, the impact of a tariff. Consider a tariff on auto imports. Without a tariff, world price PW, at PW, consumers in the U.S. purchase Q1 units, QD1 from U.S. producers, and Q1 minus QD1 from foreign producers. A tariff, T, makes it more costly for Americans to purchase autos from abroad. U.S. prices rise to PW plus T, and purchases fall from Q1 to Q2. U.S. purchases from domestic producers rise from QD1 to QD2. Imports fall to Q2 minus QD2. Producers gain S area T tax revenues from the tariffs are generated. U and V are deadweight losses. Consumers lose S plus U plus T plus V in the form of higher prices and a reduction of consumer surplus. And we can see that here. Consider a quota on peanuts. Without trade restraints, PW world price would be the domestic price. At PW, U.S. consumers would purchase Q1, QD1 from U.S. producers and Q1 minus QD1 from foreign producers. A quota of Q2 minus QD2 imports pushes the U.S. price up to P2. While total U.S. purchases fall from Q1 to Q2, those from the U.S. rise from QD1 to QD2, and imports fall to Q2 minus QD2. We can see that all here. U.S. producers gain S area, T goes to foreign producers with permits to import. Areas U and V are deadweight losses, and consumers lose S plus U plus T plus V in the form of higher prices and a reduction of consumer surplus. Why do nations adopt trade restrictions? Well, that's a good question. These are arguments used to justify trade restrictions. Proponents of trade restrictions often use the following arguments in an effort to justify their position. The national defense argument. Domestic industry is needed for national defense purposes. Dumping. The sale of goods abroad at a price below the cost of production and below the domestic market price of the exporting nation. Dumping is illegal under U.S. law. Infant industry argument. New industry needs protection so it can mature. When considering the merits of anti-dumping restrictions, remember that, number 1, firms with large inventories, either domestic or abroad, may find it in their interest to offer goods at prices below their original cost of production. Also, domestic firms are legally allowed to engage in this practice. Lower prices benefit domestic consumers. Trade restrictions are a special interest issue. Protectionism is a politician's delight because it delivers visible benefits to the protected parties while imposing the cost as a hidden tax on the public. The special interest effect provides the primary explanation for trade restrictions. Trade restrictions almost always provide highly visible, concentrated benefits for a small group of people while imposing widely dispersed costs that are often difficult to identify on the general citizenry. Politicians have a strong incentive to favor special interest issues, even if they conflict with economic efficiency. Do more open economies perform better? Economic freedom as a measure of institutional quality. Gains from trade, entrepreneurial discovery, and investment are largely dependent on institutions and policies supportive of voluntary exchange, market allocation, freedom to compete, and protection of people and their property from aggressors. These ingredients comprise the foundation of economic freedom. Trade openness and income and growth. The income levels and growth rates of 10 most and 10 least open economies, as measured by the Trade Openness Index, or TOI, are displayed here. Note that more open economies both achieved higher income levels and grew more rapidly, and thus had a larger growth rate. We can see Hong Kong, Singapore, Ireland, UK had very, very large increases in the openness score. Trade barriers and popular trade fallacies. Trade fallacies abound because people often fail to consider the secondary effects. Key elements of international trade are often linked. You cannot change one element without changing another. This is the case with imports and exports. Policies that restrain imports also restrain exports. Fallacy number 1. Trade restrictions that limit imports save jobs for Americans. This view is false because if foreigners sell less to us, they will have fewer dollars with which to buy things from us. Thus, restraints on imports will also restrain exports. Trade restrictions do not save jobs. They merely reshuffle them. Jobs saved in protected industries will be offset by jobs lost in export industries. As the result of trade restrictions, fewer Americans are employed in areas where we have a comparative advantage. Trade fallacy number 2. Free trade with low-wage countries such as Mexico and China will reduce the wages of Americans. Both high and low-wage countries will gain when they are able to focus more of their resources on those productive activities that they do well. The key to this issue is how will U.S. resources be used? If a low-wage country can supply a good cheaper than we can produce it, the U.S. can gain by purchasing the good from the low-wage country and using its resources to produce other goods for which it has a comparative advantage. Institutions and the changing nature of global trade. Countries like Hong Kong and Singapore that have persistently followed more open trade policies have achieved higher income levels and grown more rapidly than more closed economies. During the last 2 decades, trade restrictions have declined sharply, particularly in developing economies. Following the passions of NAFTA, U.S. trade with both Canada and Mexico grew rapidly. The U.S. economy performed impressively as the size of the trade sector grew during the 1990s. Measured as a share of GDP, U.S. trade with both Canada and Mexico has increased sharply as a result of NAFTA during the last 18 years. Today, less developed countries are often at the forefront of those pushing for greater trade openness, while high-income countries often impose restrictions in order to protect various domestic industrial interests and preserve the farm subsidy programs. Questions for thought. If the revenue collected by the government is taken into account, a tariff has no net impact on the welfare of society. Is this statement true? Politicians have a strong incentive to support restrictions that limit international trade because A. Trade restrictions generally benefit all or nearly all voters. Number 2, trade restrictions generally provide highly visible, concentrated benefits for a relatively small number of people while imposing hard to identify costs on others. The imposition of tariffs, quotas, and other trade barriers are often referred to as protectionist policies. Who is being protected? What are they being protected from? Exports are good. They create jobs and help make America prosperous. On the other hand, imports destroy jobs and reduce our standard of living. Do you agree or disagree? Policies that reduce the volume of imports will also reduce the volume of exports. Is this statement true? 6. Why would political officials want to prohibit their citizens from trading with foreigners? In 2002, the Bush administration imposed tariffs of up to 25% on imported steel products. This action reduced the supply of steel in the domestic market and led to higher steel prices. It increased U.S. employment because it saved jobs in the steel industry. And it reduced employment in the U.S. steel container industry because the higher steel prices made it more difficult for them to compare with foreign rivals. And lastly, helped George Bush carry the state of Ohio in the 2004 presidential election. This is the end of chapter 18. Thank you for listening.